You may be familiar with one of the ways that you can play a game with a set of dominoes. You start with one, and you line them all up, one after another, and then when you're ready to start, you push that first one over, and all of the rest are going to fall in succession. Well, this game is a very good analogy to what we're going to be talking about in this lesson. Why did World War I begin? Well, as we'll soon see, World War I began because one event led to another, led to another, led to another, just like in a game of dominoes. Let's begin. Let's take a look at our lesson goals. We hope to describe the military and political alliances created between European powers and analyze the events that finally led to the declaration of war. Now, these things will help us to learn about the causes of World War I. And we want to keep in mind that it is going to be these alliances and these events that are kind of leading to the declaration of war that ultimately push many countries in Europe over the edge and into this conflict. But as we'll see in a moment, there were other issues that were all kind of coming together around the same time that these alliances and these events take place. So let's first take a moment to look at our key vocabulary words because these will help us to accomplish those goals, and we want to make sure we're familiar with them now. So they're ally, ultimatum, escalate, mobilize, nationalist, and treaty. And you'll see these words come up throughout the lesson. Like I said, begin familiarizing yourself with them now. Maybe take a look at them in the glossary if you're not quite sure what they mean, and take notes on them as you see them come up in the lesson. Now, remember, there are certain alliances and events that are really going to push many countries in Europe into World War I, but there are some other things that were happening in the decades kind of leading up to the conflict that are important to recognize. So these things are really leading to a disruption in the balance of power of what had been previously established in Europe going into the war, and you might be familiar with some of these. Nationalism, this kind of idea that your country should not only be independent, but perhaps should be more powerful and stronger than other countries. And that nationalism is really growing in many ways as a response to imperialism of the 1800s and early 1900s. As countries and empires are growing, they're taking over other countries, and that's forcing a lot of kind of nationalist movements to grow. And so we can see kind of a direct connection between nationalism and imperialism. And we can see actually a connection to militarism as well, because as countries are becoming more nationalist, as countries are growing, and these things are seen as threats, not only within countries, but also between countries, these countries are wanting to strengthen their armies and navies. So we can see a connection there. And then we're starting to see this system of alliances developing as countries are growing their armies and navies, as imperialism is growing and nationalism is growing as well. Countries are starting to ally with one another because they're looking for strategic partners in case there is a conflict and they have to go to war. And so you can see a connection here, but really they're all kind of interconnected with one another, leading to these rising tensions that we're finding going into World War I. And since this is pretty complicated, you might want to consider an acronym to help you remember each of these issues. So you'll see that we've taken the first letter of each word. Oops, that one. And so this is a good way, NIMS, to help us kind of remember what it is that's leading to World War I. So let's take a moment now to check your understanding of what we just talked about. In this lesson, we're trying to get an understanding of the causes of World War I by answering the question, why did World War I begin? We'll talk about in this lesson the beginning of World War I by looking first at the formation of alliances. Then we'll talk about the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And finally, we'll talk about the start of a domino effect. And all of these things will help us to understand those causes of World War I. But we're going to begin with a look at the formation of the alliances. Let's begin by talking about the alliance system that's eventually going to lead to the start of World War I. So this actually goes all the way back to the 1800s, when growing rivalries and general distrust in Europe led to the creation of an alliance system. Now, the way this alliance system worked is each alliance was formed through the signing of treaties, or these kind of written documents that detail kind of all the responsibilities that all the parties involved have toward one another. Now, one of these agreements included in both of the alliances that we'll talk about, each members agree to defend each other in time of war. So that's something to really keep in mind, because now that you've kind of set the tone for this defensive system of alliances, imagine what happens when one country in one alliance gets involved in some sort of kind of conflict with a country in another alliance. Now all of the countries involved in either alliance are now involved with a conflict with each other. So we'll keep that in mind as we think about how these alliances formed. So the first one we'll talk about was called the Triple Alliance, and it started when Germany actually wanted to isolate itself from France, wanted to isolate France from the rest of Europe. So there was kind of a long-standing tension between Germany and France. It had a lot to do with the border region here, so they kind of had a conflict over certain areas and which country they belonged to. And so as a result of this tension, Germany and Austria-Hungary, so you can see Germany and Austria-Hungary here on our map, form what is called the Dual Alliance. And by 1882, Italy decides to jump on board, and it becomes the Triple Alliance. So you can see our map showing us Europe in 1882, outlining some of the countries that are going to be involved in this alliance. And you can see the Triple Alliance is noted by this kind of darker beige color on the screen. Now, in response to the formation of the Triple Alliance, we're going to see the formation of the Triple Entente. Now, by 1905, the Triple Entente included Great Britain, France, and Russia. So again, we can see our map here showing us now Europe in 1905. You can still see the Triple Alliance, this kind of darker beige color. And then the Triple Entente is going to include France, Russia, and Great Britain. Now this alliance starts with actually Russia establishing an alliance with France, and eventually Great Britain's going to join, and each of these countries does indeed promise to support the others in time of war. So again, we want to keep this in mind, and we also want to note a couple other areas that aren't actually noted on the map, but we'll go ahead and draw or write them in. This region here that you're looking at is called the Balkans, and this is going to become a big part of the story here. And what you can kind of see here down in the corner, you can see part of the Ottoman Empire, which is also going to be a big player in World War I. So we want to keep in mind what's happening in this region that's in the kind of lower right corner of our map, because these players are going to have a huge role in what ends up happening going into this conflict. Now, as a result of these two alliances being formed, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, we're going to see kind of a balance of power kind of established within Europe, but keep in mind that we're looking at a graphic organizer that's kind of in this scale design, because even though many people hoped that this would create a balance of power within Europe, you have these three major powers on both sides. In reality, that power scale is really going to be tipped kind of back and forth, and again, rising tensions in the Balkans and rising tensions within the Ottoman Empire, which we'll talk about. All of those things are going to kind of come together and really disrupt this balance of power. So let's talk a little bit more about that next. Remember, in this lesson, we're looking at the beginning of World War I by asking the question, why did World War I begin? So far, we've had a chance to talk about the formation of alliances that are creating and continuing tensions in Europe leading into the conflict. Now let's take a look at the one event that really set things off, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, which is going to create the start of this domino effect. So let's now take a closer look at Franz Ferdinand's assassination. The other major empire in this time was Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary, like the Ottoman Empire, is facing internal unrest due to multi-ethnic populations seeking independence. And so in order to try to maintain its empire's strength and to take advantage of the weakening Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary is going to annex Bosnia and Herzegovina. So they're going to make Bosnia and Herzegovina part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this was a strategy that basically had two potential outcomes, or hopeful outcomes. To one, seize Ottoman territory, recognizing that weakening of the Ottoman territory, trying to take some of that. And then as well, hoping to halt Serbian nationalism. So Serbia has this very strong nationalistic movement, and it's trying to basically seek independence for all of these Balkan regions. And so when Austria-Hungary annexes Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is going to increase tension between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. As a result of Austria-Hungary's annexation, Serbia is going to vow to take back Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in response to that, Austria-Hungary is going to swear to stop any Serbian effort to undermine their power in the Balkans. And so this increased tension is going to lead to more conflict, and kind of that powder keg is going to really get closer to being set off between all of these empires and regions. We know that rising tensions in Europe are going to lead into World War I, and it's really a conflict that's the cause of many complex things all happening at the same time. But the event that sets off the war is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And the circumstances surrounding his assassination really kind of stem from a couple of things. One, the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the decline of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which are going into decline partly because of nationalist movements within their empires. So there's a region within part of this region is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The other part is part of the Ottoman Empire, and it's called the Balkans. And within the Balkans, you've got multiple ethnic groups that are all seeking their own self-governance, independence. One of those countries is Serbia. So all of these regions are going to have a huge impact on these rising tensions in Europe. So let's take a look at a map of this region and try to unpack this just a little more. Now, first of all, the Balkans, which include the region that I'm circling here, were often called the powder keg of Europe. And a powder keg is basically an explosive device that just needs one little spark to set it off. And so, you know, a lot of people were watching Europe and believed that any little thing that set off one of the countries in this region would set off the war in the continent. And this is partly because they were pressured by powerful empires on both sides. So you'll notice that they've got the Austro-Hungarian Empire on one side and the Ottoman Empire on another. And then also notice that you're looking at a region that's on, so let's actually do it that way, that's on what we call a peninsula. So you can see that it's basically surrounded by water, and that's going to make it really susceptible to attack, and it's also going to make it a really valuable place to trade from. So you've got basically these powerful empires vying for different parts of the Balkan region, but on top of that, the region has many countries with strong nationalist independence movements. So remember, you've got all of these different ethnic groups that are all vying for independence at this time. So that's going to kind of combine with that pressure from the powerful enemies on both sides. Now, on top of what's happening here, you've also got the Ottoman Empire, which is in steep decline. Now, part of the reason the empire is declining is, like we said, because these ethnic groups are seeking and winning independence. But it's also because the empire did not industrialize as quickly as other countries in the region did. So you can see the decline of the empire here. The empire in 1683 made up a much larger region than it did by 1914, where it makes up kind of a smaller region here. So this is complicated stuff. Let's check in on your understanding of European geography in this region. The rising tensions that had been kind of brewing throughout Europe for decades are eventually going to lead to war, and the moment that really kind of pushes towards that conflict is involving this man here, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Now, Ferdinand supported Austria-Hungary's growth and dominance in the Balkans, which made him a target by supporters of these independence movements in the Balkans. And so in June of 1914, Franz Ferdinand and his wife are assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, and although this assassination isn't going to immediately lead to conflict, it will eventually be kind of the moment that many people cite as being what started World War I. And so we're going to look at his assassination as being that first domino that falls and then eventually leads to this enormous conflict that includes most of Europe and many of the countries that had been annexed by the European powers. Why did World War I begin? As we explore the beginning of World War I, we first needed to talk about the rising tensions that are growing in Europe through the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, and how those tensions are going to lead to the formation of alliances. Well, we also needed to talk about the one event that really pushed the continent and many of the continents surrounding Europe into this conflict, and that was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Now, we know that this assassination isn't going to immediately lead to war, but it's going to be kind of the first domino that falls that leads us into this conflict. And remember, we talked about the powder keg, that one spark that would lead to kind of this global war, and that's what we're going to talk about next, this domino effect that kind of begins to topple one country after another into war. So what's going to happen after Franz Ferdinand's assassination? Well, Austria-Hungary is going to use that event as an opportunity to escalate its conflict with Serbia. So what they decide to do is they're going to give Serbia a long list of strict demands that served as what we call an ultimatum, basically saying that if you don't agree to do all of these things, you're in trouble, and you have to do these things. There's no kind of compromise here. And some of the things on this list included suppressing any anti-Austrian groups and publications within Serbia, and accepting responsibility for the assassination. So let's see what Serbia does in response. Serbia actually decides to accept most of Austria-Hungary's demands. However, Austria-Hungary is basically looking for an opportunity to engage Serbia in a conflict because it's feeling kind of threatened by these nationalistic movements within the Balkans. And so in response to Serbia's offer, Austria-Hungary decides to reject it. And on July 28th of 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And that is what's really going to set off this domino effect that we'll talk in more detail about. You can see here the headline of the New York Times following this declaration of war. It reads, "Austria formally declares war on Serbia. Russia threatens, already moving troops. Peace of Europe now in the Kaiser's hands." And the Kaiser is the leader of Germany. So now that alliance system that we talked about is going to become more kind of precious and imbalanced, because now all of these countries that promise to protect one another in the event of a conflict now all have to jump into the conflict as it begins between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Now, once Austria-Hungary formally declares war on Serbia, other European countries are going to get involved in the conflict, beginning with Russia. Now, Russia has a very large Slavic population, and Slavic people are people that have ancestry in that Balkan region. And because of this and other alliances that Russia's made with Serbia, Russia is an ally of Serbia. So Russia's going to respond to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia by essentially mobilizing its forces against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the first thing Russia does is actually mobilizes its forces right alongside the Russian-German border. Now, at this point, the Russian Tsar, or leader of the country, sends a letter to his very good friend and cousin, the leader of Germany, the Kaiser, and says, we are not mobilizing for war against Germany, we're mobilizing for war against Austria-Hungary. But what this is going to do is it's going to make Germany really nervous. So Germany is going to get involved in the conflict at this point, because Germany is part of that triple alliance and therefore an ally of Austria-Hungary, remember? And so by August 1st of 1914, Germany has declared war on Russia, and because Russia is part of the Triple Entente and therefore an ally of France and Great Britain, France is going to get involved in this war too. And so as a result of this, we're going to find Germany fighting a two-front war, fighting France on this side and Russia on the other side. Once the war began, the system of alliances created a conflict that involved many different countries. And so Germany finds itself fighting a two-front war, and so it decides to create the Schlieffen Plan as a strategy in order to engage in this conflict that it would be fighting against France to the west and Russia to the east. Within this strategy, Germany planned to use minimal forces to hold off Russia and spend kind of its early part of the conflict focusing on France and the Western Front with the hopes of invading France through Belgium and Luxembourg. So you can see the map here of the Schlieffen Plan, and we can see that the German forces are hoping to get to France by going through Belgium and Luxembourg. Now, what Germany wasn't ready for is Belgium, which was a neutral country, denying German access to France through that country. And so Germany decides, well, if you're not going to let us come through peacefully or willingly, we're just going to invade you too. So Germany decides to invade Belgium, and that's when England gets involved. So the German invasion of Belgium is going to lead to England or Great Britain joining the war because Britain had an alliance with Belgium, and after Germany invaded Belgium, Britain sent an ultimatum or an offer basically with no other options. You either do this or else. So the British sent an ultimatum to Germany to withdraw. Germany refused, and as a result, Britain declared war on Germany. And you can see the New York Times headline following kind of all of this activity happening. It goes on and on about how all of these countries have fallen into the fold. England declares war on Germany. French ships are involved. Belgium's attacked. 17 million men, soldiers, engaged in this great war of 8 nations. So it really kind of, gives us an idea of just how intense this conflict got, and it happened very quickly. As we can see, this domino effect is basically going to lead to all of these nations getting involved in the conflict in a really short period of time. Basically, over a 2-week period between late July and early August 1914, the war starts, beginning with Austria declaring war on Serbia, Russia mobilizing its forces, and then within a few days, Germany declares war on Russia and France. And then, as we just saw, Great Britain's going to get involved shortly thereafter and declare war on Germany. So when we kind of see how different media sources are looking at this, we just saw the New York Times headline, and we're going to take a look at how another media source, this time a political cartoon, is looking at what's happening here. So what you see are 6 men. And they all have their hands on each other's shoulder and their fist up, almost ready to attack the person in front of them. And these are actually supposed to represent the different countries, some of the different countries that are involved in the conflict. So we've got Serbia, Austria, Russia, Germany, France, and maybe this is supposed to be the U.S. It doesn't say what's happening or the name of the country there. But you can see that it's saying hi there if you don't. So it maybe is England, and then you can see the person representing France says, if you hit him, I'll, The person representing Germany is saying, if you strike my friend, I'll. Russia saying, if you hit that little feller, I'll. Austria saying, if you make a move, I'll. And then Serbia, if you touch me, I'll. So they're all kind of saying, if this happens, remember that's what an ultimatum is. If you don't do this, this is going to happen, or do this or else. So consider what the implications are of this political cartoon and work on that on your own next.